At last, at 0400, on the 22nd of June 1941, the code word, Dortmund, crackled down the wires, and the maelstrom that was Barbarossa finally erupted. The German armies of the Blitzkrieg sliced through the Russian forces on every front. Faced by the results of his intransigent refusal to act, Stalin panicked. While his army headquarters desperately tried to piece together the most rudimentary picture of what was happening, he ordered an immediate counteroffensive on all fronts. As the first reports of the devastation his own command had helped to create filtered through, he was shattered. All that Lenin created we have lost forever, he declared. He finally retreated to his Dachau, not to emerge until the 3rd of July. But what really stunned the Red Army commanders was that the massive German assault proceeded without any artillery support. It simply sliced through. The Red Army Command had expected that there would be meeting engagements and opening actions that would develop over a period of days. Next would come a large series of complex frontier engagements, and then the real war would begin. What actually happened was that in 48 hours, in Army Group North, German panzer columns were approaching Riga.
At the beginning of the war, Soviet tank training was terrible. It was awful. The tank drivers had very little experience, probably maybe 2-3 hours on it, if they had that, by the way. The level of actually handling a tank and fighting a tank was extremely low, and it showed. It showed in the disaster which was visited on the Red Army's tank forces. The level of the training of the commanders was very poor. And that changed. It changed importantly. The Soviet training methods were completely overhauled at the end of 1942 and 1943. It was no good just pushing people in tanks and saying, get on with it, do this. They realized that for the tank force they had and what the tank force had to do, you really need highly trained crews.
In the opening days of the campaign, the two panzer groups of Army Group Center, under Hoth and Guderian, completed the encirclement of a huge hall of confused and virtually leaderless Russians near Bialystok, then surged onwards towards Minsk. This refined blitzkrieg technique of the Germans, and the use of their armor in that respect, came as an extraordinary and totally disorganizing surprise, even to the senior Russian commanders. Within 48 hours, General Staff reports made it perfectly plain they had lost control of the situation. They were in complete chaos, and many didn't know where their troops were or what was happening. They certainly didn't have accurate reports of German movements, and they were not quite sure where the German thrusts were aimed at. All that they did know was to the south. Army Group South was being slightly delayed, but in the northwest and in the west, there was total collapse. In consequence, Stalin operated his usual practice. He took out the front commanders and shot them. At the front, the rapier thrusts of the German panzer divisions were skewering through the chaotic Russian defenses. The panzer groups created deadly breaches in the Soviet line, slicing the Red Army forces into isolated segments. The supporting German divisions then moved forward in encircling advances which surrounded these pockets of defenders. The ferocity and effectiveness of the panzer attacks was so great that some of the pockets were gigantic. Groups of up to 15 Russian divisions were surrounded and mercilessly pummeled into surrender. The encirclement of Minsk by the right flank of Army Group North and the left flank of Army Group Center yielded 300,000 prisoners, 2,500 tanks, 1,400 artillery pieces. 32 of the 43 Russian divisions were emasculated within a week, and the road to Moscow penetrated to a depth of 300 kilometers. The remainder of Army Group North scythed into the Baltic states, capturing Riga, the Latvian capital. Only in the south were the German forces limited to shallow advances towards Lwów and Raunno. On the ground, chaos reigned. The Luftwaffe were pulverizing the road and rail links behind the Russian lines. Many officers were not even bothering to use code in their desperate pleas for instructions from their headquarters. Struggling masses of uncoordinated troops were being slaughtered by the German troops as they attempted to obey Stalin's orders to counterattack. Others were being machine-gunned by their own military police for fleeing from positions which were worse than hopeless. The reality was that the Soviet forces were left leaderless. They had no orders. Sometimes they had guns but no ammunition. Sometimes they had tanks but no fuel, or they had tanks which broke down with no prospect of repair. Or they simply had orders which were contradictory. The usual situation was that if in doubt, Red Army commanders would simply order, "Advance." Many of the Red Army divisions simply broke up and formed very large pockets of Red Army troops. For example, within a matter of 4 or 5 days, the Wehrmacht, the German army in the east, had managed to encircle 350,000 Red Army soldiers, the first of what was to prove a number of huge encirclements. By the 3rd of July, the battle for the frontier was over. The German armies had advanced along a line from the river Dwina in the north to the Dnieper in the south. General Halder, chief of German General Staff, declared that the war against the Soviet Union had taken only 14 days to win. But the German intelligence had totally underestimated the reserves which Russia could command. The Red Army had a great number of men, but the equipment that it used tended to be outdated and obsolete. This was particularly with regard to tanks and aircraft. In terms of signals equipment, the Red Army's position on the Western Front was quite appalling. It simply did not have the communications equipment to enable it to fight the fast-moving battles the German army specialized in. And they would be required to fight effectively in order to defend their country properly and to achieve the initiative. Therefore, it can be concluded in terms of leadership, position and equipment, tanks, aircraft and communications, the Russian forces facing Army Group Center was no way a match for their German counterpart. The invasion forces scythed through hopelessly disorganized opposition and moved rapidly onwards. Well honed, the blitzkrieg pattern was being repeated, and the Soviet defenses whirled away like chaff in the wind. The number of prisoners taken seemed too immense to be true, but it was, and the scale of destruction was terrifying. As the news of Barbarossa reverberated around a stunned and disbelieving world, even Germany was awestruck. Not all the German generals joined the celebration. General Heinz Guderian, who still held relatively junior rank, had been appalled by the headlong advances against 2 far-flung objectives. He was acutely aware that the guiding principle of blitzkrieg was the concentration of maximum force against a single objective. This had already been neglected, and where there should be convergence, there was divergence. As the army groups advanced, they moved further away from one another, instead of coming closer. Audacious though he undoubtedly was, Hitler balked at the thought of his precious armored units racing too far or too deep into the Soviet hinterland, and settled instead for a compromise with the more traditional grand strategy of envelopment. By the end of June, Guderian and Hoth's tanks had joined near Minsk to complete a huge encirclement, and by mid-August, Army Group North was approaching Leningrad. The Germans continued to achieve extraordinary success, and the Wehrmacht surged on with undiminished impetus. Incredible numbers of prisoners were taken and huge quantities of tanks and guns captured or destroyed. Despite this sustained progress, Guderian